Hi, here I am. I'm about to make my fabric collage. So I'm starting with a piece of silk, very thin silk, and behind it is a piece of felt. I've got some tiny scraps of fabric that I've saved over the years. Some of them are really, really old. Some of them have a lot of meaning. And that's one of the ones I'm starting with, is a piece of fabric that I've used in many pieces over the years, and it's from curtains that I made for my daughter when she was very little. And so it's got an ocean theme and ocean colors, and I'm really liking that. So I'm going to keep it. I'm going to snip it off so that it fits. I'm not worried about cutting straight or straight lines. I like frayed edges. I like uneven edges. And so I put that piece in, and I'm going to start building from there. I really like that little piece of orange in that fabric, so I'm cutting that off too, and I'm going to add that in. This is what I do. I just audition different pieces of fabric. I move them around. I see if I like them. I see what colors go together. So it's just a process, and I'm not thinking about it beforehand. I don't have a plan. I just go with what feels good in the moment. Now I found this piece of dyed fabric, a little scrap from fabric I dyed years ago, and it has nice fringe on the bottom. It's got magenta pink and it's got a purpley color. It's got a faded bit, and the purple really goes nicely with the blue background because it has a lot of blue in it, purple in it, I should say. And so I know I want to add that. I just have to figure out how. And I always like a little bit of fringe, so I know I want to keep that. I decide I want something in the same color family to go right beside it there. So that gets added. I'm going to take the piece of the magenta fabric and I'm going to cut it and split it. Bring that other piece back that I like. And now I'm at the point where I'm getting most areas covered. Things are coming together. I'm just wondering if I need to add another color that's going to blend everything together. Do I want blue? Do I want teal? And I decide to go with this piece of orange. And that moves the orange into the piece. Do I need another piece? I'm not sure. Just trying it out. And I decide no, I think I like that collage as it is, and it's ready to stitch. So the next thing I do is I want to choose the colors I'm going to use to stitch. So I just pull out my collection and I try and find colors that are very close to several of the colors I find on my collage. So I've picked a yellowy orange color that I think will accent really well. I've picked a seafoam, a magenta, a darker turquoise, and then an orange color. One more color I wanted to add, which is this bright parrot green. And then, aside from that, I wanted to show you the thimbles that I use. I have a hard one, I have these rubbery ones, which I really like, and I also always have this blue tape on hand. It's called Flex Wrap, and you just cut off a piece and wrap it around your finger, and it works really well. And also I have Thread Magic on hand. It's a wax, and you put it on your thread, and it helps it to glide through the fabric. I also have this double-ended needle threader, which I really enjoy. And it's by Colonial. There it is. And then lastly, a pair of sharp scissors. And now we're ready to stitch. So now that I've got my basic collage made, what I like to do is to baste the pieces down. I've tried all sorts of different ways over the years to secure my pieces, from doing nothing to using bits of glue or fusibles. And what I've found is, for me, I like to just tack everything down with basting stitches. And you can choose a contrasting color so that it's easy to take it out later. I tend to try and use a color that blends with most of the pieces so that it doesn't distract me while I'm working. And so I'm making tiny little stitches through the front and just securing them very loosely in place so that they don't fall to the ground, basically. If I step away, I'm not working on it, I come back and I've forgotten where I put everything, or there's many things that could happen to kind of make these pieces come apart, and I just want to keep them in place. Once you get some of your initial stitches down, this isn't really necessary, but at the beginning, I find that it's really helpful for me. And the reason I don't use the fusibles or glue is that I find what I really like when I'm stitching is for my needle to go in easily. I don't want to have to pull too hard or yank or go through too many levels of thickness. And so for me, this just works out the best. Some people have really good success with using just little bits of either fabric glue or even just glue stick, or they really like using fusible. And I used to do that. So here's what it looks like on the back. It's just pretty big stitches, and I don't usually even tie a knot with this. I just leave it, and then I don't want this getting in my way, so I just snip off the end. And depending on whether these little tiny stitches distract me later, I'll pull them out. Sometimes you end up using a color where you don't even see it. So for now though, everything's secured. It's not going to come off. If I go away and come back, and now as I stitch in one spot, it's not going to come off in another spot. So I'm all set to go with my creative stitching. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about thread. I use embroidery floss, the 6-stranded kind. And what I do, what most people recommend, is you don't use a piece that's too long. And what I learned early is that you hold the beginning part in your fingers and then you stretch all the way out the length of your arm. And that ends up being a length that's really workable but lasts long enough. So that's what I generally do. And for most of my stitching, I use 2 strands of the 6-stranded floss. So you can see it separates out fairly easily. And I've got the 2 here that I want, and I'm just going to pull. And it does like to twist. You just keep an eye on that while it twists. There's lots of little tricks people come up with to keep it from tangling. You see there's a little knot that's formed there. There, so there's 4, and I'll put those aside, and I've got my 2. Now, in terms of the size of the needle, I try and use one that's not too big, that's pretty close to the size of the thread I'm using. So here's the one I've been using recently, and I like the eye to be close to the size of the needle, because in case I want to do French knots, if the end part of your needle is bigger than the shaft, then sometimes it's hard to pull your French knots through. So for me, because of reasons, I'm actually using a needle threader, which I didn't used to do, but now I find it's really helpful. So if you've never used one, you just take your needle, the eye of your needle, and you put it through the threader, and then you take your thread and you put your thread through the large hole, which is very helpful. That's why I like this threader. And then you take your needle and you pull it off and pull out the threader, and then your needle is threaded. Now I want to show you the way that I knot my thread. I think it's called a quilter's knot. I've heard a couple of other names used. I found when I learned it, it was really easy and quick way to knot. So what you do is you take the end of the piece you're working with and you point it towards the needle. So this sharp part of the needle is pointing towards the thread, and you overlap them, and then you grab this end piece, you hold it, and then you take the thread and you wind it around the needle a few times, and then you start to pull it down, and then you grab it with your fingers here and you slide that knot all the way off the needle and all the way down to the end of your thread. You just keep holding it and pulling your thread through, and then you have a knot. And it's really handy and it's really quick. Usually you do it quicker than that. I just did it slowly so you could see. And now I'm going to use some thread magic. I don't always use this, but I find that when I have these longer lengths of thread, that sometimes it does get tangled quite easily. So I just run it through here, and some of the wax gets on it and keeps it from tangling while you're stitching. Now I'm going to put on these thimbles. I'm going to just protect my fingers, ready to start stitching. So I picked this seafoam color to start with. Here's my piece. And I thought I'd start making just some really simple straight stitches, which is mostly what I use. And just start to secure. Now this part of stitching, you know, I call it intuitive stitching because I don't have a plan about what I want it to look like. Sometimes I get an idea while I'm stitching and I try something different, but in general, I really like just doing these straight stitches. And I just place them wherever I feel like. And I really like the color of this little ocean bit of fabric. So I chose to use a color of floss that is close to it. So at this point in my stitching, I'm not looking for a contrast. Sometimes I like to overlap into the next piece. Kind of it adds some continuity from one color flowing to the next. So I just work along like this, usually until my thread runs out. Sometimes I get to a point where I want to stop and change colors before my thread runs out. But a lot of times I just get in the flow of stitching and I just keep going and going. Now I'm starting to feel the needle pushing on my finger here, so now I'm going to put on that other piece of the flex wrap. just more to protect my finger. I have this other thimble I have ready in case I want to push something through. This has got a hard end on it, so I'll pop that onto this finger if there's something that I want to push on, but for just normal stitching, this just protects my finger from getting tender. Only downside of using these thimbles is that they make your fingers sticky and grippy, so sometimes what happens, so it just happened there, is the thread kind of sticks and you're trying to move your hand around and you can make a tangle. I think I want to jump back and maybe place a few more stitches here. I can see I also want to put some stitching up here. So I could underneath just jump from here to here. I generally don't like to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to knot off right here. What I do usually is I just go through once. Sometimes I'll go through a second time like that and make a knot and then snip it off. So I think I am going to go up here. So again, I'm going to make a new knot. That same way that I do it. Pull it down. There, I've got my knot. So I'm going to come up in here. Straighten that out a little bit because it's just lightly basted on in the middle. The shape sometimes can just shift a little bit while you're stitching. So when you're working this way, there's lots of different options about, see, this is getting stuck again. That's the annoying thing about wearing these on your fingers, but it's worth it because it protects them. So you can, you know, this would have been a slightly different look if I would have decided to put stitches across following the line of this, but I felt like doing up and down stitches, straight up and down, all in the same orientation. And I could use this to go over this orange part here, but right now I'm just feeling like color matching. So that part's done. So I'm going to knot off again, and then I think I'm going to go and just put a few more stitches on this corner. Knot, and then a few more stitches over here. Oh, there's a little knot that formed, which happens sometimes. Usually, oh, this one's really small. Sometimes you can. It's really just knotted on itself. There it came out. So if you can get in there and loosen it, it's usually doable. Sometimes it's not, or sometimes you get frustrated and you just don't want to take the time to do that. But it's usually worth it. You can see, I'll show you in a second here, that the piece of felt that I have underneath for my batting isn't exactly the same size as, look at that. So my fabric goes over the edge, especially on this side. But that's okay. I decide later what I want to do about that. I can add another little piece of felt if I really feel like it's necessary. I can leave it. I can, in the end, I could fold this over like this when I make my border and let this piece stick out, or fold this piece out underneath as well, I mean. So I don't worry too much about that. I find I like to work with my felt being smaller than my fabric. Some people like to have their batting sticking out around all edges and then they trim it later. For me, it's the same reason that I use a matching color when I do my basting, is that I find it really distracting if there's a white or a black piece of felt sticking out. It becomes part of the design for me, and so if it's there, I'm not going to trim it off later. I like to sort of do that beforehand. It's the way I like to work, and I figure out later how I want to deal with these uneven bits, which don't really bother me. So there's the first part done. Okay, now I'm going to work with the plum color, and I'm going to work on this patch, and I decided what I want to do is go around the edges almost like a blanket stitch, but just to give a look of a patch. I always think of this as a patch when I do this around a piece. Old-fashioned patch. You see the way I was stitching, where I'm pulling it all the way through, going back in. There's another way to do this stitch, which is a little more efficient. So what you do is you go in, and instead of pulling the needle all the way through, I come back out about where I want to be for my next stitch, and I pull through, and then I go down and I come out underneath about where I want to be for my next stitch, and come out. And I'm not looking to be really precise. I like the kind of more organic look. I don't mind too much if it's not perfect. I try to have a certain amount of continuity, but not some, there's you know, markers like these fabric markers where I could go through and I could measure and make dots to help me, to guide me to make them absolutely straight, which some people love to do. There's certain circumstances where I do things like that, but in this case I feel like I just want to wing it. So now instead of going right beside, because of the angle I'm at, I'm actually going diagonally. I'm coming out at where I want the bottom of the next stitch to be instead of the top. I'm calling this the top and this the bottom. And so you can do either one, and it really just depends on, for me, it depends on what's easiest given the angle I'm working on and what's easiest for me. Now I'm going to try and do a stitch here and guide it to this corner, and then I think what I'm going to do is come out right beside where I went down, and then make a stitch that way. So now I'm doing the same thing, working diagonally, except I'm coming up inside the fabric, or at the top. I was calling this top bottom, so top bottom is the way I'm thinking of it because of the angle it is to me. And just working my way around. And when I'm coming down at the edge of the fabric, I'm coming down outside of the fabric, but close to the edge. I could make a longer stitch. I could have made them longer and done it that way. I just felt like doing it this way. Put it down. I've made my way around, and you can see that it's uneven. These stitches are longer, these stitches are shorter, and I think it looks good. It's not perfect, and that's the way it is. It's the way I like it. Now I'm going to add a few stitches down here on this other piece with the same plum color, and I think what I'm going to do is just do in and out straight stitch across here. And one more. There. Okay, at this point I'm speeding up the video portion while I stitch, just so that it's not too long as I continue on in this project. So what I'm doing here is I'm just taking some of that parrot green color, and I've decided to do some stitching in that lower corner over that darker green color. And I'm really doing the same thing where I'm just adding straight stitches. Right now I'm adding stitches both on the patch that has the ocean colors and the dark green patch. And then I'm just going to continue adding these straight stitches. And when I say straight, I mean the stitch itself is straight, but the way that I'm putting them into the piece is definitely not straight. I'm not worried about that. I'm letting them actually go on different angles. It adds an organic feel. And I'm just moving through this one area on this small piece and adding lots and lots of stitches in this green color. So it's adding another layer of both texture and color. And I really like the way that these really simple straight stitches done slightly wonky angles add this feeling of earthiness, greenery. It reminds me of the outdoors. I also have that ocean themed piece in there, so it could be water rippling or reflection. Just makes me think of nature and the outdoors, and the way that a meadow or grass has many colors. And I'm just moving through here, getting all the surfaces covered in stitches. And when I'm finished this portion, I'm going to take a long look at my piece and ponder what I want to do next. At this point, I have no plan about what I want to do, and I just need to walk away for a few minutes and think about it and come back and look at it with fresh eyes, with an idea about what I want to do next. Now there's enough of the initial stitching done that I really have time to look at where I'm at and see what I want to add to it. And it's really coming to life, and I'm starting to feel it's speaking to me in a way, and I'm able to move on. There we go. So I've pondered my piece, I've decided what it needs next, and it's a bird. So here's the bird, cut out of black fabric using one of my templates that I've made myself. And I'm just placing it on there, and yeah, that's right. That's what it needed. That's what I want. The bird's gonna stay. To attach my bird, I've decided I'm going to use 2 strands of black embroidery floss, and I'm going to hold it on with my thumb as I stitch around. I'm not using any adhesive, just holding it with my thumb. It's small. It doesn't need anything else in this case. You could very easily attach a fusible to the back and iron it in place, and that would work. Or even use a little dot of fabric glue or glue stick. But for me, I find this is really manageable and easy to just hold it with my thumb. So what I'm doing in terms of stitches is I'm using straight stitches that are going perpendicular to the bird all the way around. And the reason I'm doing this, oh, there's a knot. It's just caught on itself. So if you pull on these knots, they do often come out. And then you can just continue. So I'm going around the bird, stitching in a very similar way that I did with the pink patch. Just these long straight stitches and freehand spreading them out close enough together so that it will secure the bird. But I'm not worrying about perfect distance. But you very well could get a white chalk pencil and mark dots evenly around to help you get some really nice stitching on there. But I'm not worried about that. I like the unevenness of it. And the reason I've decided to do these straight stitches all the way around the bird is because I'm not doing any other decoration on the bird. I want this to just be a silhouette. If I was going to be adding feathers, details, other colors, I might decide to sew straight, matching the lines of the bird, so that these other stitches would match any kind of feather detail that I added. But because I'm not doing that, this kind of echoes what I've done elsewhere, and it adds kind of chunky, folksy feel to it that I think is going to work really nicely here. So I'm almost finished. Back to the spot where I started, just on the other side of the bird's legs. I'm doing the last little bits, that little piece of feather that's sticking out, which is a very tiny piece of fabric, and heading towards the legs, which are also very thin little pieces of fabric. But if I make small stitches, I'll be able to secure them down. Just 1 or 2 right in the middle to hold them in place. And now that this is secure, I can begin doing some creative stitching in all the different colors of thread that I have, with this nice black bird in contrast to that. So I'm just finishing up. This is looking good. I'm happy with it. At this point, I'm going to look at my basting stitches, and I can still see them a tiny bit, and down here I can't see them as much, but it's okay now to take them out. They're not needed to hold anything, and I feel like it might be less of a distraction for me if I just snip them out. Pull them out. And then these ones I can't see, so I'm just going to leave them, but they've come out of the top part. That's done. So it's time for more stitching. I'm using magenta, the same that I'd used on the patch, and I'm going to go down the side. I'm going to start up at the top of this patch of light turquoise, and I'm going to do the same stitch that I've done on the magenta patch, sort of echoing. I'm going to move along the top, and then once I get to the corner and start moving down, what I'm going to do is make it a thicker, more dense stitch. So the mark making here is going to add texture and color, and the idea is that it's going to balance out color-wise and going to add another layer of interest. So now I've made it down to the bottom of that turquoise patch, and I'm continuing that line down into my base fabric, the blue silk. And once I've gotten as far as I think I want to go, I'm going to work my way back, and I'm going to make that a denser stitch. So I'm stitching in between the previous stitches that I made. And I'm not trying to make this even, continuing with my theme of uneven stitches. Just going to make it a nice mark of color. I take a look at it and I decide it needs a little bit more. So I just fill in some spots where I think I'd like more stitches until I think it's a nice solid line of that beautiful color. Now I'm using a pale turquoise to go around this piece of orange fabric, and I'm just going to go around and around, filling it in almost like a satin stitch, and just to give it a nice pop of color around the edges. Okay, new color, slightly different shade of turquoise. I'm going to put it on my needle, and I'm going to start stitching in the background. There's my quilter's knot. This stitch that I'm using, I call it the wandering stitch because it's the straight stitches that I'm using throughout this piece, but it's going in all different directions, and I really feel like I'm wandering with my needle as I go back and forth. I go up and down, but really I have a direction that I'm planning to wander in as I fill the space. These little lines add color and texture. And because of the backing of felt, it puffs up the piece a bit, which is nice. So there's all sorts of texture that's added on many levels doing this stitch. So I'm just moving around in my background, the blue silk, and now I'm going over to the other side. I'm doing the same thing over here. And what you're going to see when I flip it over is that I don't have batting on that very edge there. My fabric is bigger than my batting. So when I want to go up towards the top, I'm going to change my tactic here and not use a wandering stitch. I'm going to do an in and out to get myself to the top. And there you have it. So I'm continuing with this same darker turquoise color, and I've decided to put some French knots up in the corner on this pink patch. So what I'm doing is wrapping my thread around the needle 5 or 6 times, pulling it through. It's a little easier to do this if your finger doesn't have a thimble, so I pull that off. And I'm just going to add as many as I think looks good. I don't want to pack them too tightly, but I just want to have little dots of color in the pink area. So I just jump around, up and down, back and forth, finding places that are bare. I'm trying not to really make a pattern. And then I'm going to move down underneath the tail of the bird and add a few more French knots. I find it's a really good idea if you have one element, particularly one that's noticeable like a French knot. If you have one element in one area of your stitched work, then it's good to add that same element somewhere else in the work, in at least one other place, but maybe even 2 places. It's the same with painting. So now that I've done that, I'm moving over to the other side of that light turquoise, and I'm adding stitching amongst the stitching. So that first layer of stitch that's on there is the lighter turquoise. This is the darker turquoise. And so I'm just adding, filling in between where the original stitches are. So it's adding color and dimension and texture again. So because I'm putting stitches on this side of the strip, I'm going to continue and work my way all the way back to the other side. So when I get to the end here, I'm going to turn and start stitching in the direction of the other side, adding stitches as I go. I rethread here with a new piece of floss in the same color, and I'm just going to work my way over, under and around the legs of the bird, and fill in with the same straight stitches on this other half of this pale turquoise piece. Filling it in with the same stitches and giving it a nice unified look as the background and the backdrop for this bird. Now I'm going to switch to orange, and the color is very similar to the orange that's in the middle top. And so I'm just adding some stitches right along the top for unity, and then I'm going to knot off and continue to add some of this orange. Along the bottom. I've decided to do French knots. So there's my third spot where I have French knots. Right along the darkest part of that pink. It adds a nice highlight there. Next, we add a border. There's so many different ways to add borders and edging to stitched works. I pulled out a piece of this orange and I put it behind everything that I'd done so far, and I loved the look of it. So I decided that this was the border and edging that I was going to use. So I cut it so that it's a little bit bigger all the way around on all sides, and I begin to stitch it on. So I'm using a running stitch to attach this, and that allows me to have some flexibility in terms of how I want this extra piece of fabric to look. If I smooth it out, it will look one way, and if I pull the thread tighter, the fabric will pucker, giving a different look. So attaching this way gives me a lot of flexibility, and it allows me more time to make a decision about what I want as I move around attaching this piece of fabric. So as I'm working around the piece, I'm noticing that I do like the look of this extra fabric being sort of flat and flush to the piece. And then I most likely am not going to want to pull everything tight and have puckering. So as I finish up on the last side, I'm going to continue to smooth out the piece as I look at it. So I'm going to knot off my thread and then begin the final step in completing the border. So what I'm doing is folding the fabric back on itself, and I'm going to stitch all the way around using a blanket stitch. And then I'm going to go around the piece several times again using different colors of floss and making uneven stitches. So this is more of a mark making process than anything else to add color all the way around. And so the stitches I'm using here is, I think of it as a backwards blanket stitch. And I just am spacing them out. I'm angling them different ways to kind of make triangle or X formations. I'm just looking at the piece as I go, deciding in kind of an intuitive way where to make a mark next. So I'm kind of moving backwards and forwards in the same spot and then jumping ahead. I switch colors, and I'm just going to continue to move around the piece in this way, adding colors and continuing to look at the piece and thinking about what color I want to place where. And so there's going to be spots where there's a lot of one color. Black's a strong color, so I tend to space the black out more than I do the other colors. I just continue to work around in this way. So that large piece of orange fabric that maybe looked a little bit overwhelming at first has been reduced to these little peaks of color, and it's been integrated because of all the colors of floss that I've stitched and made these lines all the way around the piece. This last step of adding the border was exactly what this piece needed to complete it and tie everything together. Here we are. We're done. You've made it to the end. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.